Hey guys, this is Tyler here. It is October 23rd and I'm here in Estonia. So I'm going to discuss the rise of MGTOW in America or USA. I know people sometimes say, okay, could be Canada, could be Mexico. In this case, I'm going to talk about MGTOW and USA. USA has been a huge player, the growth of philosophies and the growth of trends worldwide. This is certainly the case with MGTOW in USA. It's been a huge player in the mainstream notoriety of MGTOW, and it will just continue to grow, I think, in the future. What USA has probably even more so than within Canada, because I've spoken about Canada before, is the media presence, the adoption of trends in USA, which is huge. Trends take off in USA, or philosophies take off, they take off everywhere, basically. There's an old saying that what often becomes popular in California becomes popular in US. And I think often this is the case. What becomes popular in the US becomes very popular worldwide. And I think US has had one of the most interesting past 100 years when it comes to relationships, dating, and marriage. It's been really interesting, the rise and fall of dating and marriage scene in America. If we go back to the era of my parents, when they were growing up, 60s, 70s, they're baby boomers, it was very good for the most part. For a man, when it came to dating and relationships, it was phenomenal. Often guys had more than one option at that time in high school. Even the most uncool guy would often have at least one girl that would want to go out with him. Now, if you go back to my grandparents' era, they were growing up in the 1930s, 1940s. It was even better at that time. That was really the golden years when it came to dating and relationships in the US. This was the era that began relationships, married, and would stay in relationships and marriage the whole life. That's just what it is. Typically, marriage is ended at that time. It was the man deciding to go forth with this. And whether or not these couples were happy in their marriages is a different story. But what we do know is that there was a very high amount of loyalty in marriages at that time in USA. That was just how it was. As the years and decades progressed, we got obviously into the 70s and 80s, which were still pretty good for the men. Then of course we got into the millennial generation, and this is where things really started to crumble and became just a huge mess. Truthfully speaking, this mess honestly was more created by all the problems. The mess was simply because of the root problems that existed. The relationships and marriage situation was just because it was the culmination of all these other things occurring at this time. It just resulted in this utter collapse. And then we had other ingredients that were also added to the situation, like technology and the rise of social media and computers, phones, cell phones. All of this just added to the equation. And it gave us what we ended up having in more recent times. And then of course there's Generation Z, that's even younger than me. And they've even had it a bit worse than Generation Y. US absolutely was a core country of MGTOW worldwide. And I think it's been at the forefront. Until recently, this term MGTOW wasn't very well known to the masses in USA. I myself did not first hear the concept of MGTOW probably until about 4 years ago. It was actually by the world famous Sandman YouTuber, and that's where I heard about this, and I slowly began to learn more about this philosophy, and that's where I learned about it. But it actually probably isn't until the past 2 years that it's really became mainstream and became a very well-known philosophy. As I've spoken about before, many of the reasons why MGTOW grew in Canada is also the same reason it's grown in the US. we could first look at the presence of social media. Social media has had a huge impact in terms of how it's influenced the behaviors, psychology of both men and women, and certainly women when it comes to relationships. We didn't see a very large presence of dating apps 10 years ago, and this is something now that exists. There wasn't such a thing as social media mainstream 20 years ago, and this also has totally taken off. These are two of the biggest areas I think that have contributed to the rise of MGTOW, because when we look at how it influenced the system of hypergamy, it was able to substantially elevate the average SMV of a typical woman just by the fact that it showed all the available people that were out there for dating. At one point in time, only the people in one social circle or perhaps in a school or work setting were dating options, whereas this largely increased the pool. And of course, it ended up being largely in favor of women. They were able to really capitalize on this and essentially find what were perceived to be the highest value men in that society, in that culture. It's had a disastrous impact more recently in many countries because, as I've said before, it's almost became more of a type of social media, a new form of Instagram. The people that it does work for, it generally works mostly for females in the US, and it works for a very micro niche percentage of men out there. And typically these are men that already could date many other women. They may already have girlfriend or wife. It's completely useless for the masses of men, which is one of the main reasons many men have, of course, gone MGTOW or are part of this incel category. It's absolutely terrible what it's turned this ecosystem into. If we look at the earlier days of dating, if we look at like the eHarmony or Match.com, I remember as a younger guy, I was probably like 11 or 12, and I remember seeing commercials of eHarmony, and my dad at that time was like, you know, this is going to become huge, this online dating, Tyler. Give it like 10 more years. Keep in mind, this was probably around 2003, maybe 2004, and I was like, yeah, maybe. At this time, you actually had to pay a lot for these websites. I don't recall what it was. I want to say it was probably at least $100 a month to use like eHarmony or Match.com. It may have been more, may have been a few $100s. It was a lot at this time. That was just for the basic subscription. This was a whole different type of online dating at that point. This was really the start of the whole online dating market. And of course it took several more years for it to really take off. But when it did take off, it became huge. It, of course, had a lot of disastrous effects on the dating scene as a whole for men. The online dating, of course, was one avenue that caused these issues. We could look at the workplace environment, how this evolved. If we went back to the 1960s and 70s, even at that time, many females were not in high positions in the workplace or even in modest positions. Many of them were in the lower positions if they were in the workplace. And they were pretty content in that area. And as the years went by, it just became more and more elevated. Their expectations and what they thought they deserved income-wise and status, all of this just began to elevate and elevate. And of course, it pushed many men out of the same kind of positions. It created a system where men weren't just competing against other men, they were competing against many women in the workplace. Unfortunately, when it was man against man, it was often a more objective metric system for employment and for hiring. But when women became a major force in the workplace, the women in many cases started to be given preference for the interview process and for hiring. They had to start meeting these quotas. They had gender quotas, of course. We all know about here, these equal employment opportunities that became the norm in the workplace. And as this slowly became the norm, this had a tremendous effect on men in the workplace. It essentially made many of these men unable to attain these positions because they were knocked out. This started becoming I think probably bigger in the 90s when the impact started to be felt. And of course, what it also did was, because the average woman's income was going up, it also was hurting men when it came to dating, because men were having to make a lot more money, because women could now make a salary on a ratio basis that was much higher than what they were making even 20 years before. And this had disastrous effects on the whole dating scene. I think the 90s was where this really started to kick into full gear, and it just really started to pick up momentum. If we look at the system with public sector jobs, government related jobs on the municipal, state, national level, this had a huge impact also. The salaries in these job positions, education being one of the leading industries of public sector employment in USA, was going up tremendously. The salaries were going up tremendously, and the rate of female employment in these sectors was going up drastically. The average salary compared to GDP, or compared to the average living standard, was going up quite rapidly. There was a point in time when public sector positions, for the most part, apart from people that were in political seats of office like senator or congressman, most of the public sector jobs were not deemed as being very good paying jobs, and most people wanted to stay in the private sector. But man, have times changed when we look at what it's like now. Now many people, of course, flock to the government sector. But I recall people like my parents, my uncles, telling me about, like, in the 1970s, these types of jobs were not very sought after. These government jobs were often what people took if they didn't have any other options. They would take these job positions, and the tides totally turned. In the past 20 years, 25 years, salaries, the benefits, the job security just skyrocketed, and these became really sought after job positions. And likewise, these jobs also had very strict requirements when it came to gender quotas for hiring, and they would have to absolutely hire so many females compared to men in these job positions, whether it was on a municipal, state, national level. When we look at the government sector as a whole, it tends to have a very large ratio of female to male employees. This is how the system is set up now. Even the military is this way. If you go back to the military 50 years ago, there are so many more females in the military compared to men now than there were before. And often too, there's a lot more females in higher positions of the military and in these very sought after officer positions. And this is the same across the board. Police, firefighters, and all sectors. Libraries, another example. If we looked at the average salary of the librarian in a state like California, it's skyrocketed. These librarians that have been in these positions for like 20, 30 plus years, they're making ridiculous salaries and benefits, and they're going to get these ridiculous pensions, or they already have started receiving these pensions. This is all fuel that's been added to the fire. Another area, of course, is the influence of entertainment and movies, television. This had played a huge role all across the world for decades. And this certainly was the case in the US. The US, of course, is the core point of a lot of this entertainment that everyone across the world watches and views. Hollywood, of course, was the core of entertainment for so many decades. Now, of course, it's changing presently. We're seeing a bigger presence in countries like Germany, in countries like China and India. But to this day, the U.S. still plays a very big role when it comes to the entertainment industry. And they've had a lot of influences. These shows and movies, the thousands of shows and movies have generated billions, hundreds of billions of dollars over the many years on the minds of people. They've programmed people to think in a certain way. They certainly programmed females and males to think about relationships and marriage in a distinct way. Some may argue that the media industry was simply following the trends or the social trends and norms of the era of the previous decades. The movies and shows were being modeled off of the current trends. Yes, that was true to an extent, but there's no question they have also started and influenced trends that have taken off in the US and of course worldwide. If we look at some of the shows of these previous decades, the most popular shows, you can certainly see that they established trends in both the US and the world. Of course, within relationships and dating, it established this norm, we may call it, on what the man and women were supposed to act in relationships, and often put a huge amount of expectation on how the man was supposed to be, how they were supposed to act, how much money they were supposed to make, and how they were supposed to be with their friends and family, society as a whole, and how they were supposed to empower their woman and everything else. It left huge expectations. People were largely influenced by these shows and movies, and they started to become meshed into real life, unfortunately. When we go back to shows or movies of the 1960s or even 70s, it wasn't so bad because the realities at that time were something more realistic. But as the years progressed, these expectations became very distorted, and it became very unrealistic for men to have to meet these expectations. I remember a very classic movie known as The Graduate. This was a very famous movie. I believe it was from 1967. Essentially, the plot line is this guy, and he's kind of hooked up with this woman. She's like a MILF. She's like 20 years older than he is. Unique. The movie, it was very controversial, this film, and many people were vehemently against the topic of the film. And it though portrayed something new that people weren't accustomed to seeing, this MILF concept, someone being in a relationship with both the parent and the daughter. This was something that wasn't something that people saw in film. This may have happened in society in the late 1960s, but they certainly weren't portraying this and emphasizing this in the media. This film, of course, played Dustin Hoffman, and Bancroft was the female actress's last name. Very interesting movie, though. The progression of film and television and entertainment has left a huge impact on millions and billions of people, starting at a young age, and of course most recently with the advent of computers and through networks like YouTube and other online streaming platforms. People everywhere in all continents from all social classes have access to this entertainment, and they can be influenced by this entertainment. We've seen more recently very well-known artists such as this famous Cardi B singer, and she's unfortunately influencing millions, maybe tens of millions of females, girls and younger women, and she is currently setting trends of society. Maybe concepts that have already been known, but she's normalizing other newer concepts, other areas that people quite recently wouldn't have accepted as appropriate, and she's making these things mainstream. And this is a really unfortunate thing occurring in our society, but this is how entertainment influences the masses. And this is why people should also consider in the coming years, perhaps there has to be some kind of censorship and government overhead put on these avenues of entertainment. TikTok, of course, was a recent example where it was very clamped down upon by the US government. Starting from the top, President Trump, of course, clamped down on this particular platform in America. And this could also become more common in other areas, that the governments and countries may start clamping down on some of these forms of entertainment for the masses. The last area I want to discuss here is the impact of the education system is huge. Education has been a huge influencer of young people now for many decades. When we look at the masses, they've been attending public schools for many years. The number of people now from America that have gone through public schooling is probably in the hundreds of millions. I myself, fortunately, only had to go through public schooling for 1 year when I was in high school. I actually went through mostly private schools. I fortunately came from a background where my parents were able to afford for me to attend mostly private schools. But I did have 1 year of public schooling, and it was horrible, honestly. I hated it. If I could go back, I would have tried probably just doing like homeschooling or something. I would have done like I would have just gotten the GED or something and just been done with school. Public education system, of course, has served as more of an indoctrination system starting from primary school through postgraduate education. It's been absolutely terrible for both men and women. When my parents were younger, it served a little more utility. It was a little more focused on academics as a whole. But as years progressed, and especially in the past 3 decades, it's became terrible. What it's done to the minds of young people starting from 4 or 5 years old till 20s. It of course serves some value. I think the STEM areas are a very important area for people who are able to progress through these sciences, more quantitative areas. The education system has served more to program and indoctrinate younger people to think in a certain way. And it's certainly not in a way of critical thinking. When we're looking at aspects such as gender and how the genders are treated, there's a huge difference between how males are treated compared to females. This has been statistically proven in many states, and this is often seen, especially when it's in the case of how female teachers treat female students. Now, this is not, of course, 100%. There's exceptions, but this is often how it goes. And then if we look at how male and females learn, males, of course, learn more hands-on, by hand. Females, of course, learn more by observation and are just more adapted to sitting in a desk for an hour or 2 hours at a time and just listening to a teacher starting from a young age. And boys as a whole are not like this. And then if we start looking at how topics, curriculums are being taught and designed, there's a huge political message being put in these lessons and curriculums. It's especially obvious in how males and females are portrayed and the gender norms, and there's all sorts of political messages in these curriculums starting from kindergarten, first grade up through university. It's absolutely terrible. It had such a major influence and impact, I believe, on the current political environment in the U.S. It had such a harsh effect. If we look at systems like the Teachers Union of America, it's huge. It's a machine. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. One of the most powerful public organizations in America. And this is a whole different video topic for another time. I'll do another video on this system because there's so much more to this. I have family members that are teachers or have been in the public school system, and I have friends that also have been teachers, and there's a lot that I could tell you guys. I'll just try to keep this brief here, is that the system has had a lot of influence on children, and this system of education, which is actually more like indoctrination, has been very impactful on females as they get older, and has programmed them in such a way that has caused many of the current societal problems we see now. I have to be very candid about recognizing the system here also, because it's ultimately the system that's programming them to think in this way. The system, of course, has replaced the impact and importance of people's parents. They've, of course, received more influence from the system than their parents as a whole. And this, of course, is why governments have wanted kids to start school earlier and earlier in USA. Often kids would start school at the age of like 7, if we go back 40 or 50 years ago, whereas now it's like, I've heard like 3-4 years old. It's just crazy. They want to start these kids at the youngest age and then have them in the education as old as they can get, late 20s, even early 30s. And because this, of course, is how they can strongly influence the way that these people think, especially females. And also, when we look at how the university system has swayed largely in the favor of females, it's became, I think, in some cases, like 2/3 female and 1/3 male, and state universities now they of course are really pushing to have more and more females in these education systems so that the government can influence them in the way that they would like these people to be. And of course, this goes deeper. This is also tied to the interest of large corporations and the economy, and it goes a lot deeper than this. But this is on the surface what it pertains to. And they, of course, have heavily more scholarship. There's largely more scholarships out there for females than males. I know Sandman and his channel has covered this, that there are way more scholarships for the masses. And Better Bachelor also has discussed this topic, available for females in American universities than the males. This is just how it is now, because they serve as indoctrination centers at their core, starting from pre-kindergarten through postgraduate university. This has definitely been one of the major pillars for the US government. This is the first part of this video here, and I'll be doing a second part and perhaps a third part in the future. Give me your feedback below, and thank you.